Good evening. My name is Greg Masterson. I'm on the board of Tales of Cape Cod, and I have the privilege of introducing our speaker this evening. But first, I want to thank you for supporting the Tales of Cape Cod. We are an all-volunteer organization, and all of the money we raised is used to support our mission. And our mission is connecting people to the history of Cape Cod and preserving this building, the old colonial courthouse. In addition to the summer speaker series, we conduct oral history interviews, support historical research, present an interpretation of the Body of the People protest to Barnstable school children, and make this building available to the community for weddings, memorial services, and meetings. If you have attended Tales of Cape Cod events in the past, you are probably aware that we are engaged in a multi-year program to restore this building. The next phase of this program will address the accessibility of the building. We plan to redesign the walkway to the front and construct a ramp so entrance to the exit from the buildings are fully compliant with the Massachusetts accessibility laws. We will share more information on this project later in the summer. Recommendations from our members and guests are always appreciated. If there are topics you think would make interesting programs in our summer speaker series, please let us know. If there are activities that you think would be of interest to our members and guests, please let us know. If you would like to volunteer to support the Tales of Cape Cod through our programs, activities, or building restoration work, please let us know. Our program this evening is sponsored by Robert and Candace Thompson. We thank you for your generosity and support. Are Candace and Robert in the audience? Thank you very much. Following this evening's program, you are cordially invited to join in the meeting room for a dessert reception. We hope you'll take the time to appreciate the mural and pictures that depict Barnstable Village in the mid-1880s. Our speaker this evening is Eric J. Dolin. Eric grew up in New York and Connecticut, and from an early age was fascinated by the natural world, especially the ocean. He holds degrees in biology and environmental studies and environmental management and environmental policy. Eric has held a variety of jobs throughout his career, including policy analyst at the National Marine Fisheries Service, program manager at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, environmental consultant, as well as internships at the National Wildlife Federation, the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, and the U.S. Senate. Many of his books have received accolades from the Washington Post, the New York Times, Library Journal, Amazon, and the Massachusetts Center for the Book. Eric is with us this evening to share the topic of his latest book, A Furious Sky, the 500-year history of America's hurricanes. Eric, please join us.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I've got to get back into my computer again because when we closed it, it closed out, so wait a second. But in the interim, I would like to extend an extremely deep felt thank you to Candace and what's your husband's name? I can't remember. Bob. Okay, Candace knows me from when I lived in Washington, D.C. What, you can't hear? That's okay. Candace knows me from when I was in Washington, D.C. I was working, let's see, at that time, who was I working for? I think it was EPA, or may have been before that. But anyway, I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And this is about the year 2000 when I told, well, about 1999, 1998, I told my wife I wanted to be a writer. And she said, well, you've got to start writing books, and you've got to put aside a whole year's worth of your salary before you can consider quitting your job. So I worked for many years, and that finally happened in 2007. I'd been a full-time author since 2007, but one of the earliest books that I wrote, actually it was about the fifth or sixth book, was called Snakehead, A Fish Out of Water, about the snakehead fish, an Asian invasive species that was gobbling up Washington, D.C. at the time. And I was there, and Candace was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and she wrote a lot of great articles about the snakehead controversy, which I wrapped into the book. It was great fun meeting Candace. I don't think we met in person. We talked on the phone a lot, and I had this image of a really hard tax, old line reporter type. She was tough. She had a saucy sense of humor, certainly in the emails and other stuff. And unfortunately, that book didn't help me much in my quest to be a writer, because it came out, and 2 months later, I moved up to Massachusetts, and Smithsonian Books got very upset at me because they wanted me to go around and talk about the book. But I think you have one copy there, Candace. I think maybe 12 other copies sold. No, probably more than that. But it wasn't a whole heck of a lot, but it was one of my favorite books. So thank you for sponsoring this, both of you. I really appreciate that. And thank you for showing up tonight. Wanted to start, what is that in the lower right? Okay. In writing this book, I came across a lot of really fascinating stories that stuck in my mind, and there are actually many more stories than I could actually put in the book to make a clear narrative arc. But one of the stories involved the great colonial hurricane of 1635. And on that day, in August of 1635, there was a ship called the Watch and Wait, which was leaving from Ipswich, Massachusetts, heading to my hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts. And on board were 23 people, including Anthony Thacker and his wife and 4 of their children. As they rounded Cape Ann, we're right off of Cape Ann, the hurricane stormed in and threw the little boat up against an uninhabited island. The boat was destroyed, and Anthony Thacker and his wife are the only 2 people on board that survived. They managed to swim ashore with barely a shred, with only about a shred of clothes on them, and they lasted for 5 days on this island eating some food, in particular cheese, that had washed ashore. And then a fisherman came by, they flagged him down, and he brought them to the mainland. And when the Massachusetts legislature found out about Anthony Thacker's great tragedy, they felt so bad that they deeded him the island upon which he had foundered, which is known today as Thacker Island. And here you have the twin lighthouses of Thacker Island. It's part of Rockport, Massachusetts. Now, this story comes from the Miami hurricane of 1926. A few miles to the north of Miami is a city, now it's a city, called Fort Lauderdale. And there was a husband and wife who were in their house at the time when the hurricane roared in. The roof of the house collapsed, pinning the man under a block of cement. His wife held his head up as the water rose. He begged her to leave and save herself, but she stayed until the water was right at his chin and finally gave him a kiss, rushed out of what remained of the building, and unfortunately he was left behind to die. And then there's this story from the great hurricane of 1938, and there's somebody in the audience, I won't point them out, but right before the talk started, they told me that your grandmother died, your great aunt died in the great hurricane of 1938, which slammed into the eastern tip of Long Island and then clobbered much of New England. Now, on that morning, on September 21st, when the hurricane struck, there was a man on the eastern tip of Long Island that had been eagerly awaiting a box from Abercrombie and Fitch. It was a brand new barometer, and he was very excited about it. And that morning, the box came, he opened it up, took out his barometer, and proceeded to get really angry because the needle on the barometer was pointing to a reading that was so low that it could only mean one of 2 things. Either a hurricane was fast approaching or it was already there. Yet when he looked outside, the water was calm and the sun was shining overhead. So he sat down to write an angry letter to Abercrombie and Fitch. He hopped in his car, drove to the local post office, mailed the letter. He shouldn't have been so rash because by the time that he returned, his house and his precious barometer had been washed away. This hurricane was known as the Long Island Express. It was traveling up the East Coast at between 50 and 60 miles per hour. So that's why people were completely overwhelmed when it struck. Now, A Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but it is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There is an intriguing history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war, and the fortunes of individuals. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology add to the story, as does the women's movement and its role in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront thorny questions of how we can learn to survive and adapt to the continued barrage that's going to come from these, the greatest storms on earth. Hurricanes are an inevitable and painful part of the American experience. If you're among the tens of millions of people who live on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, in the Caribbean, or in Hawaii, not in California, hurricanes are a reality that eventually, perhaps, or will possibly invade your life. It's something you have to worry about each year. I was asked the other day why hurricanes don't strike California, and it has to do with the winds aloft mainly and also the cold temperatures of the offshore waters. Now, the hurricane season officially runs from June 1st to November 30th, and while I was driving here this day, I saw signs on the highway, and I was surprised to learn that this is Hurricane Preparedness Week in Massachusetts, or maybe nationally. I had never heard of that, but there were signs announcing hurricane preparedness. I'm glad I didn't bring a hurricane with me, but the day that this book was published, on August 4th, 2020, a hurricane struck the United States, and now I'm totally spacing on the name of the hurricane. But I remember the editor of the New York Times tweeted out, "There was never a more propitious book launch than this book." Now, in an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes, which have winds of at least 111 miles per hour, sustained winds. Now, typically 2 hurricanes make landfall in the United States each year, and a major one clobbers us about once every 2 years. Now, hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been struck by hurricanes over the centuries, the residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for 40% of all hurricane strikes. Now, here in New England, we have a hurricane that makes landfall about once every 10 years, or about 10 times a century. And landfall is defined as where the eye of the hurricane crosses the coast. A lot of people thought that Hurricane Sandy was a New England hurricane because it was 1,000 miles wide and caused some devastation up and down the coast, but it actually made landfall in New Jersey. We have not had a hurricane for quite some time, and I think we're due. I'm not wishing it on us. It would be horrible if a major hurricane hit the Cape or any place along the New England coast, but statistically, we're getting closer to our time. Now, hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for 50% of all the natural disasters that have cost at least $1 billion in damage. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed at least 30,000 people. And if you go back further in time, the number would be much higher. Now, A Furious Sky is a history of the hurricanes that have struck what is today the United States, because I had to narrow my focus. I didn't want to write a book that was 1,000 pages long, so it focuses on all the hurricanes, not all of them, but the major ones that have struck what we now know as the United States. But before going any further, I need to define a term in simple English. What is a hurricane? Hurricanes are violent swirling storms with sustained winds, and sustained winds means wind at 33 feet above ground level for a solid minute, with sustained winds of 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, providing the heat energy necessary for the storm. Two other conditions that are necessary for a hurricane to form are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air rising from the ocean's surface. As that air rises, it condenses, it cools, and forms clouds. But in that process, something called the latent heat of condensation gets lost, and that's the real juice or the energy engine for the hurricane. Now, hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to up to 1,000 and over 50,000 feet high. They rotate in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. And they're characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. Now, hurricanes have had a significant impact on the course of American history, and in particular, colonial history. For example, two strong hurricanes that struck the Caribbean in the summer of 1780 killed more than 20,000 people and destroyed numerous British and French naval vessels that were in the area. The French decided it was far too dangerous to remain in the Caribbean during hurricane season. So during the winter of 1780 and 1781, they fixed up their ships as best they could. And in the summer of 1781, they decided to go north for two reasons. One was to escape the height of hurricane season in the Caribbean, but another reason was to help their new allies, or relatively new allies, the Americans, in their fight against the British. Now, by following this course of action, the French played a critical role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake and the ultimate American victory over the British forces in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19th, 1781. But actually, Cornwallis didn't do the official surrendering. He stayed in his tent and claimed that he was ill and sent his second in command. So when Washington saw this transpiring, he said, I'm not going to accept a sword from a second fiddle, so he sent his second in command to take the sword. Because Cornwallis knew, as did most of the people in England at that time, and Lord North in particular, who wailed, oh no, it's all over, that this was not the real end of the war. There's still additional fights after that, and peace negotiations really kicked into high gear after the Battle of the Chesapeake. Now, of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the founding of the United States, and over the past 238 years, there have been hundreds of hurricanes that have impacted us. One of them is the Great September Gale of 1815, which is just a hurricane by another name. This is a painting that was done not too long after the hurricane of what supposedly downtown Providence, Rhode Island looked like at the height of the storm. I went to Brown University as an undergrad, and there's a nearby school called the Rhode Island School of Design. On the edge of one of their buildings, there are two plaques which are above your head. And they tell you how high the water crept during the Great Gale of 1815 and the hurricane of 1938. The hurricane in 1938 went about a foot and a few inches higher than the Great Gale of 1815. But it's just amazing to think how much of the city was inundated. And that's what happens when you have a storm that comes up Narragansett Bay and then gets into the narrow Providence River. It acts like a funnel. Now, the Galveston hurricane of 1900 leveled the entire city, and killed at least 6,000 people, perhaps 10,000. We don't know the exact number because there were a lot of tourists in town, and they don't keep particularly good records on who's just transiently visiting. But the Galveston hurricane is the most deadly hurricane or natural disaster in America's history. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps in the Florida Keys where World War I veterans were working to build a highway down to Key West. It is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane to hit the United States, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts of more than 200 miles per hour. And this picture, as it says, that was the relief train that was sent from the tip of Florida down to the work camps to hopefully evacuate the men. But there were a lot of delays, and by the time the train arrived, it was just in time for a major wave to come in and knock the train off its tracks. But amazingly, there were quite a few people in the train already, and none of them died. But about 435 veterans and other locals called conks who lived down in the Florida Keys also lost their life. Now, at one of the work camps, a doctor came upon a veteran named Elmer Kressberg, who had a 2x4 that went clear through his body, just underneath his ribs. Amazingly, he was still alive, and he was in relatively good spirits. The doctor said, I'd like to take that 2x4 out of your chest, and I'm happy to give you some morphine to dull the pain. Well, Elmer knew what he really wanted. He said, no, I really want a couple of beers. So they went and got him 2 beers. He drank both of them, and then he said to the doctor, pull. The doctor did, and Elmer died. Now, the great hurricane of 1938 delivered a body blow to the eastern tip of Long Island and New England. It resulted in $300 to $400 million worth of damage, and it killed 680 people. It basically sent the entire region back about 100 years in time because all the railroads didn't work, the phone lines didn't work, electricity was out, and it took quite some time to dig out from that massive storm. And the other thing that the Great Hurricane of 1938 lays claim to is the worst natural disaster in New England's history. But I'll tell you one other thing that it did, which you will all be thankful for, especially if you like autumn and you like colorful leaves up in the New England mountains. When the hurricane ripped through New England, it was still traveling very, very fast, even by the time it got to the White Mountains. In fact, when it hit Mount Washington, it knocked the cog railway off of its rail bed. But what it really did that is beneficial to us leaf peepers is it knocked down not millions, billions of pine trees. And pine trees are very effective in blocking the canopy and outcompeting deciduous trees. So once those pine trees were knocked down, the deciduous trees had a great time growing in their stead. And that's what we have to thank all those beautiful reds and yellows and greens in the fall for. Now, the actress Katharine Hepburn, who had already won an Oscar, her first Oscar by this time, was at her family's Victorian summer mansion in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane struck. She and 5 other people, including her mother and her brother, were in the building. And when the hurricane came in, the building started getting ripped apart and torn from its foundation. So they climbed out a back window just before it started to collapse, and they had a rope, and they each held onto a piece of the rope, and they climbed a nearby hill and broke into an inn that was closed for the season. So they survived. But as Katharine Hepburn turned around to look at her family's house, she recalled that we saw the house slowly turn around, sail off to the northeast, and start down the brook which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away, easy as pie. Later, she called her father in Hartford, and when she told him what had happened, that the house was gone, he responded, I suppose you didn't have brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire. She got her sense of humor from her dad. Now, Hurricane Camille in August of 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi. And of the many people who suffered during Hurricane Camille, none had a more tragic time or more of a burden to bear than Paul Williams Sr., the longtime caretaker of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul, his wife Myrtle, and most of their children, and he had a lot of children, chose not to evacuate, but rather stay in the auditorium, which you can see, it's the second building over next to the church. Now, the hurricane demolished the auditorium, and in the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with one grandchild and his beloved wife, Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. Oh, before I do it, just recall another thing that's in the book that really struck me hard. You know, Paul Williams lost about 15 people in his family when the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 rolled through. There was a family of locals, as I said, they're called conchs down there in the Florida Keys, that lost, I think it was 75 members of the same extended family. Anyway, Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile wide swath of misery through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged, rendering 160,000 people homeless overnight. The total damage approached $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the aviary was destroyed. And the staff at Zoo Miami, to protect the Caribbean flamingos, they herded them into the men's bathroom. And this is them. And this picture was all over the place on newspapers in the following days. Now, hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note, the most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11th, 1992. It killed 6 people and cost $3.1 billion and crippled the tourist industry for the better part of 5 years. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for the film Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie crammed into the ballroom at the Westin Kauai Hotel to wait out the storm. At the height of the storm, Steven Spielberg, being the consummate videographer, I mean, he would be a film master of film, decided that this was too good of an opportunity to pass up. So he and a couple of the crewmen walked down to the shore and they filmed the massive waves blasting the coast. If you've seen the movie, there's a scene that looks like a hurricane sweeping in, and that, in fact, is real footage from Hurricane Iniki. Now, they all survived, but unfortunately, all of the movie sets on Kauai were destroyed. So Spielberg and a couple of the actors had to fly back a few weeks later and go to Oahu to film the final scene of the movie. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever in United States history. It left about 1,800 people dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around New Orleans left up to 80% of the city submerged in water that was up to 10 feet deep. Now, it's no surprise that this happened. For one thing, unfortunately, the levee systems and the walls were not in good shape. Neither was the pumping system. But New Orleans, as probably most of you know, is a big dish, like a bowl. And about half of the city is 6 feet, an average of 6 feet under sea level. Nobody should have ever built in New Orleans. And if you go back in history, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend any New Orleanians, but if you go back in history, back in the late 1700s, the 1700s when the Spanish were there and the French, they had a levee system even back then. They knew that hurricanes were a real problem. But let me get to the end of this, and I'll tell you a story that'll make you even sadder about New Orleans. This water, that's about 10 feet deep, some of that, they called it hazmat gumbo. Because imagine all the oil in the streets, pesticides, everything got swept up, and a lot of people got sick in the days after the hurricane because of contact with this rather poisonous water. But the real sad coda for the Hurricane Katrina story is that in the years after the hurricane, the federal government and local authorities spent close to $100 billion shoring up the levee system, rebuilding the walls, building the largest pumping system in the world. And just in 2019, this system was supposed to ensure that New Orleans could deal with another hurricane of the size of Katrina, a Category 3 hurricane that even made a direct hit for 100 years. Well, unfortunately, in 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers that built most of this structure was doing studies, and they suddenly discovered that the walls and levees were sinking into the sediment beneath. So no longer does it provide protection against Category 3 storm for 100 years, and they're trying now to figure out what to do, how to spend money to shore up New Orleans' protection system. Anyway, 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29th, 2012. Its striking right near Halloween meant that the media had a field day. They called it the Frankenstorm and the Halloween Horror. And it indeed was rather horrific in its impacts. It killed more than 150 people and resulted in $65 billion worth of damage. Sandy's waves pounded the shore with such force that the vibrations were heard 2,500 miles away. In Seattle, seismographs out there registered the hurricane coming in. And keep in mind, Hurricane Sandy was barely a Category 1 hurricane when it struck. Now, New York was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines, like this one, and automobile tunnels were flooded. And at one point, close to 1 million Con Edison customers in and around the city lost their electricity. And the hits just kept on coming. The 2017 hurricane season was one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore. But what really set 2017 apart was that 3 out of those 4 hurricanes, the major ones, 3 out of the 4 hurricanes that made landfall were major ones, all Category 4s. Now, I got to say, 2017 hurricane season is the reason that I'm here talking to you today, because I've written 14 books, and every single book that I've written, I came up with the idea, with the exception of 2. One is my book on lighthouses, Brilliant Beacons, and the other one is this. After the 2017 hurricane season, my editor and the head of sales at W.W. Norton contacted my literary agent and said, hey, would Eric like to write a book on the history of America's hurricanes? He's just the guy, because a lot of my books cover centuries of time. So my agent wrote to me, and I said, I have no idea. I really have never experienced a hurricane. I don't know a lot about them other than what I've seen on the news. So I went off for about a month, and I read a bunch of books on hurricanes, and I realized that it's really a fascinating story using hurricanes as a narrative backbone to tell a larger story about American history. And I said yes, I had to write a proposal, and that's how this book came into being. So out of great suffering came at least one good thing, this book. Now, each of the ones that struck in 2017 were Category 4s with winds of at least 130 miles per hour. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, making it by far the most expensive hurricane season on record. And when you think about these numbers, it gives you a sense of how enormous the American economy is, how many blows it can sustain and keep moving forward. It's really amazing. Those numbers are just mind-popping. Now, Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain in Houston. This is a picture of a rescue of one of the women from there. And within 48 hours, and it doused Nederland, Texas, which is not too far away, with 60.58 inches, the all-time record for a single storm in the United States. The weight of the water was so much that it depressed the Houston area 1 inch, the crust of the earth. Now, Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, setting a world record for sustained winds intensity. And Irma, when it struck the tip of Florida, it killed 50% of Florida's orange crop. So if you remember orange juice prices going up, that was a large part of the reason for it. Now, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4 with winds of 155 miles per hour, and it dumped up to 3 feet of water in some areas. Now, Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every human-made structure on the island outside of the capital of San Juan and many within the city's limits. And it left the entire island, 3.4 million people, in the dark. The death toll for Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with the range going from a low of about 1,400 to nearly 5,000. Some of the most destructive hurricanes to reach our shores. It also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, and communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743 that moved from Philadelphia to Boston, Benjamin Franklin became the first person to realize that hurricanes had forward movement. They moved over great distances, and also that the winds of a hurricane could blow in a contrary direction to the direction in which the hurricane was heading. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, arguments between amateur and professional meteorologists helped to develop the basic image of a hurricane as a mass of swirling, moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one travels towards the center of the hurricane, and the clear, calm, and surprisingly beautiful eye. This guy on the left, James Espy, was a rather arrogant professional meteorologist. The guy on the right, William Redfield, was a self-taught meteorologist, and they both came up with theories for how we get the winds of hurricanes, and each of them was half right and half wrong. But the thing that was amazing to me is for 20 years, the press of the day had hundreds of articles about this controversy. It was followed like, a Super Bowl game. And but that guy, when you read the way he talked, Espy, Redfield was a real gentleman, really knew what he was talking about. This guy did too, but Espy was the most arrogant SOB. I really didn't like writing about him. But anyway, the advent of the telegraph, and what I think fascinating by Morse is we know him for the telegraph, but did you know he really wanted to be an artist? And he went to Europe and he painted for many years, and he's painted some very nice paintings, but he wasn't able to get any really big commissions. So he came up with this idea for the telegraph, which finally made him famous. That's what he really wanted. And then the radio helped us track storms and hurricanes. And then really important were the hurricane hunter planes, which fly into the center of a hurricane. Sorry, my allergies have been a little bad lately. So, and then Earth orbiting satellites. And all of these advances have contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. So it's no longer for a hurricane to sneak up on us, but they have many twists and turns, especially right before landfall, and there's a lot of mysteries that we still don't know about how they actually operate. Now, these are some guys from the National Weather Service monitoring a hurricane. I want to mention one thing about hurricane hunter planes. I really enjoyed writing about that because I learned so much. You would think that flying into the heart of a hurricane would be a very dangerous profession, but there have been many, many thousands of hurricane hunter flights, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and only 5 planes have ever been lost. 4 of them who were chasing typhoons, one of which was chasing a hurricane, Hurricane Janet in 1955. There have been a lot of flights that have been rather bumpy, but one hurricane hunter pilot said the most dangerous time, the thing that he fears the most, is driving to the airfield and climbing the stairs to get in the airplane. Now, there have also been dramatic changes in the way we identify hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor to today's National Weather Service, began naming hurricanes after women. This decision angered many who thought it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One woman said she would much prefer that an unnamed hurricane strike her house than one named after one of her husband's former girlfriends. So the Weather Bureau was not persuaded. They stuck with the female-only naming system, making it permanent around 1956. Protests died down, that is, until Roxy Bolton, shown here with Eleanor Roosevelt, spoke up. Roxy Bolton lived in Florida. She was the vice president of the National Organization, one of the vice presidents for the National Organization for Women. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, vicious, and treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being arbitrarily associated with disaster. So Bolton offered some alternatives. She said hurricanes could be named after birds or perhaps U.S. senators, since they liked having things named after them. Just imagine hurricane, if you remember Goldwater or Javits hitting New York City. But anyway, she even recommended that hurricanes be called himicanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then, during Jimmy Carter's presidency, he appointed Dr. Juanita Krebs to be the head of the Department of Commerce. She was the first woman to hold this position, and she was an avowed feminist. She heard about Roxy Bolton's cause, and she decided to support it. And because the United States has a lot of power with the World Meteorological Organization that controls the naming convention, in 1979, gender equality finally won out over tired bureaucracy. And from that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes have alternated between male and female names. But if you were paying attention last year, we had a very active hurricane season. It wasn't a particularly strong hurricane season, but we had many, many names. So after we ran out of the 21 male and female names, what did we go to? We went to the Greek alphabet, which is what they had been doing for decades whenever we ran out of 21 names. Well, apparently a bunch of people complained. I'm not sure what their complaints were, but they were loud enough so that this year, the World Meteorological Organization has ditched Greek names. There will be no more alpha, beta hurricanes. Instead, once they go through a list of 21, they'll go to the next list of 21. So you'll see that happen if we get beyond 21 tropical storms and hurricanes this year. Now, the cycle continues. Every year, a new hurricane season unfolds. No matter what an individual hurricane season brings, one thing is certain. The United States will continue to be pummeled by hurricanes. And because of global warming, hurricanes of the future will most likely be worse than those of the past. Global warming has already, and whether or not you believe it's created by human beings or not, I'm not going to get into that argument. But bear in mind, I worked in the global warming division of EPA for 6 years. So anyway, we know for a fact, I don't think anybody disputes that the average surface temperature of the Earth has been going up. And in fact, as a result of that increase in temperature, sea level has risen, both due to the melting of glaciers and the thermal expansion of the ocean. For example, right off of New York City, the ocean was an entire foot lower on average, the ocean height, than it is today. So what that means is the higher the ocean goes, the higher the platform upon which the surge and the waves from a hurricane can ride, and creating more damage. And a growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation during hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain higher concentrations of moisture, which can come down as rain. Considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy, the raw energy for the hurricane, are going to result in stronger hurricanes, meaning that the winds are going to be stronger. So much of the evidence points to the fact in the warmer world, which is predicted to take place later on this century and right now, hurricanes are going to get stronger and wetter. And there's another branch of research which is equally disturbing, but is more recent vintage, and that is research that points to the fact that in a warmer world, hurricanes might move more slowly, so they're going to linger longer. And that means that areas that get struck by a hurricane will have longer amounts of precipitation, and they'll be pummeled by the winds for a longer time. And just think about Hurricane Harvey. It was barely a Category 1 hurricane when it slammed into the Texas coast. But because it hung around for nearly 2 days, that's why we had that dramatic deluge. Now, at this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists, who are by nature very conservative, and I find very honest people, would be the first to admit that there are still many unknowns as well as limitations in the data and modeling that make it exceedingly difficult to predict how hurricanes will behave in a warmer world. But the mounting scientific consensus that an increase in global warming will likely make hurricanes of the future worse, however, is not encouraging. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society will still have to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, more and more people are being exposed. This is Miami Beach. Just amazing. If you ever read the history of Miami Beach, it's fascinating. I've only been there once. I went down for a wedding about 4 years ago, and I just marveled at both the beautiful beach, but the amount of construction there. That used to be a mangrove swamp. And they predicted with Hurricane Irma, which they thought was going to make a direct strike on a little bit northern part of Florida, the insurance industry did a prediction before the hurricane struck that if it had hit Miami, like the hurricane of 1926, they would have expected $200 billion worth of damage. Now, as this book was heading into the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian, you might remember that in 2019, riveted the nation. It was in late August 2019 that Americans watched the almost around-the-clock coverage of Dorian as it traveled over the Atlantic, gaining strength, reaching an enormous size, and becoming a Category 5 hurricane. It also appeared to be heading directly for the east coast of the United States, the southeast coast of the United States, so we were paying particular attention. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place for an excruciating 40 hours. And when it finally moved on, destroying Abaco and other parts of the Bahamas, it was only a Category 2 hurricane, but some models still had it striking anywhere between Florida and Virginia. So massive evacuations were ordered in advance of the storm. Over the next few days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status as it moved over the Gulf Stream and warmer waters. Then it dropped to a Category 1 hurricane just before making its only landfall in the United States at Cape Hatteras. After that, Dorian zoomed off in a northeasterly direction and then struck Nova Scotia, where it left 400,000 people without electricity. Now, while Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what happened to the Bahamas and what might have happened if the hurricane had plowed head-on into the coast instead of skirting the mainland, clipping North Carolina before sailing off into the North Atlantic. This time, America was lucky. But if the history of U.S. hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. I just realized this talk is kind of a downer, isn't it? Sorry. Hopefully another hurricane won't hit here. But this is the last slide. This is me when I had brown hair. And this is, does anybody know where this is? It's on the Cape. It's not too far from here. No. It's, Falmouth. Yeah. You remember Hurricane Bob? Okay, Hurricane Bob. My wife, my fiance at the time, was working for the state of Massachusetts on a tree planting program. And it was actually a very unusual program. It was called Mass Relief. And their slogan was, plant a person, plant a tree, because it was a cooperation with the funeral directors in Massachusetts. So every time somebody was buried in the ground, they would buy a tree, and we'd plant a tree. Very interesting. But anyway, that was her program, but she also did stuff with Arbor Day and anything tree-related. So they sent her down to Falmouth to see what Hurricane Bob had done, and I went down with her, and I'm carrying, that's her camera case. It's not my fanny pack. through a camera case. And we actually saw a microburst in the middle of Falmouth. There was a little pine forest, and it was amazing. About, I'd say, 150 feet wide. Just a swirl, like matchsticks, all in one direction, and the center open. It was really wild. But this is right behind that house is the bike path, and where the Falmouth road race is, a race that I ran a number of times. I worked at Woods Hole once, a long time ago. I got a lot of stories about Cape Cod. But this is one of the summer cottages that have been destroyed by Bob. And it was really amazing to see the destruction. And I haven't been back there in a number of years, but I'm pretty sure that they rebuilt a lot of those little cottages. They're probably a little better designed. Put them high, the stilts? Okay. But every time I look at this picture, I feel sad. Not because my hair's gray, I don't mind that. Because that was I love that shirt. My fiance, Jennifer, didn't like that shirt. And when we got married, we moved in together right before we got married. And she had to move me out of my apartment in Newton into Somerville. And she said, Eric, don't worry. I will pack up your clothes. I said, great, great. So I realized in the move from Newton to Somerville, I not only lost my Hawaiian shirt, but I had a suede vest I really liked. And my wife decided I was too much in the 70s. I needed to graduate to the 80s and 90s. But anyway, so I lost both of those things. Anyway, that's the end of the talk. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Your question? Yeah.
I have a question. What are your thoughts about the variations in all the different computer models we see that do the storm prediction?
Well, I read a number of books that were very, very technical, well beyond my ability to understand the quadratic, all the equations and the physics that go into what goes into those models. So I don't understand the models at a basic level, but the short answer and the correct answer is that they're based on different assumptions, different data inputs to some extent, but it's really, they run millions and millions of equations. And if you have different models that take the raw data and compute it in a different way, that's why you're going to have different outcomes. And the further out you go from your initial state, because of chaos theory and other things, the farther and farther away you're likely to be from the actual track of the storm. You're going to start varying from reality. But I will be the first to admit, one of the things that I hesitated in writing this book, I said to my publisher, I said, I'm not going to get into computer modeling heavily because this is a popular narrative. And it was very complex because one of the first books I read was written by an MIT professor, and he's a meteorologist, and it had so many equations in it, I got very nervous. But hopefully that's enough of an answer for you to understand. And I'm mortified because I went down, my PhD's from MIT, but it's not in science. And for my whole life, when people find out I have a PhD from MIT, they either ask me to calculate the tip at dinner, or they assume I'm good at math. I am horrible at math. My wife does all of our financial planning. I stay away from numbers. Anyway, yes? There's no real difference. There's just different names. I mean, hurricane comes from the Caribbean, various native tribes, Mesoamerican tribes, called these wild winds hurricanes. The English turned it into hurricane. Other places called it something different. But typhoon is what they call basically a hurricane in the Pacific. In the Indian Ocean, they're called cyclones. We also call them cyclones here. I mean, cyclone is describing just the swirling storm, a tropical storm or a hurricane. And in Australia, they call them willy willies or cockeyed bobs. So there are different names, different places, but they basically mean the same thing. Yeah. Yeah.
What surprised you most as you researched this book?
What surprised me most? That question. No. No. What surprised me most? I think one of the things was this great storm controversy in the 1800s. I have a whole chapter on it. It was just fascinating how they tried to understand how hurricanes operate. Another thing that really surprised me is that hurricanes, and it shouldn't have, but that hurricanes had a real impact on colonial history. Not only the Revolutionary War, but the initial founding of North America by the French and the Spanish. There are a couple of really great stories there about hurricanes. Also, a hurricane greatly affected Christopher Columbus's fourth voyage. So those kinds of things fascinated me or surprised me. But the real answer is everything surprised me. You have to understand, my undergraduate degree is in biology and environmental studies. My master's degree, I went to Yale for in environmental policy. And then I went to MIT for urban studies and planning or public policy. I am not a historian. The last history class I took was when I was a freshman. I am an historian. I've written enough books, I'm an historian, everybody calls me an historian. But I tell stories, but I'm not a trained historian. The last history class I took, and if I could go back I would have taken more, was when I was a freshman in college. So what that means is that almost every single book that I've written, except for one about the cleanup of Boston Harbor, which was an outgrowth of my PhD dissertation, every single book I've written is on a topic I knew very little about. I'm not an academic who's worked in one area my whole life. I had a number of jobs and I have a number of interests, and a lot of my books are quite different. So each book is like getting a master's degree in that topic. And when I start the book, I know almost nothing about it. And by the time I finish it, I'm sick of the topic, and I move on to something else. Because for this, a lot of my books, people have asked me to write sequels. I wrote a book called Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America. And a number of people asked me to write a modern history of whaling, but I was done with whaling. I wrote a book on the China trade from the American Revolution through the Civil War. And the U.S. Trade Representative wrote me a letter saying, I love your book, I give it out to people in China. My books are all translated into Chinese, by the way. I've never been to China. But so he said, you should really write a book about the modern history of China and America. Not interested at all. Fur trade, I wrote a book on the fur trade that stopped in 1904. And somebody approached... now I'm in hurricane. Well, hurricanes, I wrote the whole 500 history. There's nothing left for me to write. My next book is on privateering during the American Revolution, how privateers helped to win the war. And it's going through the editing process right now. And I really like the book. But I've liked all my books. And maybe that's maybe I guess it would be pretty horrible if I didn't like my books. But anyway, yeah.
Did you actually chase a hurricane? And if you did, can you describe what it's like?
No. Here the verisimilitude. Okay, this is a pat silly answer for that, but I wrote a book on whaling. I've never killed a whale. I wrote a book on the fur trade. I never trapped a beaver. I wrote a book on China. I've never been to China. And for hurricanes, the only hurricane that I came sort of face-to-face with was, I think, Gloria. When it rolled into Boston, I think it was Gloria. I got to go back and check. But at the height of the hurricane, it wasn't major in Boston, but the winds were really whipping, and I was a big runner at the time. So I said, I'm going out to run. So I ran up and down the Charles River, and the most exciting story I can pull out of that is all of a sudden I was whacked in the forehead by a large oak leaf, and it must have been going at least 50 miles an hour, and it really shook me up. And that's it. That's my most exciting hurricane story. I've never been in a hurricane. I didn't ask to go on hurricane hunter flight, although I would, maybe someday. A number of meteorologists I know have read my book. I've gotten to meet a lot of them. That's really neat. And I suppose if I went down to Florida and I tried to get some connections, maybe I can go up in a flight. But I wrote a book about pirates. I've never robbed anybody. I thought it would be a great stunt after I wrote this book, Black Flags, Blue Waters, to get media attention. Maybe I should go into Marblehead Harbor and commandeer a yacht. Hold it hostage.
I'm wondering about the history of hurricanes on the top.
The history of hurricane, well, the hurricane in 1938 did a number. Edna did a number. Hurricane Carol came through here. I don't have large sections of the book about that. But there have been many, many hurricanes. The hurricane of 1635, the Great Colonial Hurricane, William Bradford wrote about it. So did the Governor Winthrop. It pummeled Plymouth and areas to the north. Bradford wrote about how many houses were knocked over, people killed, the number of Indians, Native Americans were killed during the hurricane. We don't have great records on that storm, but that was probably one of the biggest or most powerful hurricanes to strike the coast. I really had a sobering thing. I know a lot of you are from Cape Cod, and I love Cape Cod. I've spent so much time out here. I feel worried for the future, not necessarily the next 10, 20 years, not just for hurricanes, because you're in a big sandbar, basically. And I went to the Cape Cod Natural History Museum today, and I looked at this map they had. They had what this area looked like 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and then 2,000 years in the future. And basically, if I looked at it correctly, 2,000 years in the future, a couple of thousand feet, I mean, thousands and thousands of feet of the edge of Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard are going to be washed away. So there, I guess got you depressed again. I'm sure your houses are all in great shape and are gonna make it. But if a hurricane strikes, if a Category 3 hurricane struck Cape Cod head on, it would be a massive disaster. Not just rearranging Chatham bars and all your beaches, but a lot of the houses would be in serious trouble.
Wasn't Bob a 2 or 3?
I think it was a 3 when it right before it,
Right in the
yeah.
middle of that. Yeah, we found it.
Yeah, so
Hurricane.
and unfortunately, because of global warming and because of the shifts in temperature, you've probably read a lot about lobsters. The lobster industry is having a tough time in Long Island, both due to soft shell disease and warming waters. And lobsters are moving further and further up the coast because the Gulf of Massachusetts is getting noticeably warmer. So we're getting different species hanging out up here. But the thing is, warmer water is the fuel for hurricanes. So although not many hurricanes come up the East Coast and strike New England, if they have a warmer slug of water to travel over as they're coming up north, the odds are they're going to be stronger. So, I mean, look at Boston during a nor'easter. During a bad nor'easter, Boston gets flooded. Downtown Boston, even with the river, the harbor walk. And, today when I drove here early in the day, we had a lot of rain. I went through some roads that had almost a foot of water sitting on them. So, anyway, you don't mess with Mother Nature. Hopefully it'll miss Cape Cod. Oh, yes.
You haven't mentioned the hurricane of 1944.
Right.
Is there anything you can add to it? Because I find that there are many people on Cape Cod now who have no idea of the devastation to Cape Cod that hurricane.
Yeah,
delivered.
I only talk about it very briefly in the book. I do mention it, but not extensively. But one of the things the hurricane of 1944 was very important for, it was one of the first hurricanes in which they actually sent a plane out to monitor it, and it helped figure out the trajectory to some extent of the hurricane. But I don't know a lot about it. I know it did cause a lot of devastation.
They cleared the beaches basically from Great Island, West Yarmouth, down through the Yarmouths, Dennis, Harwich. And all of the cottages, one of which was in my family, all of that timber landed down in the Chatham area. And I've been told by a friend who grew up shortly thereafter that it was many feet deep. The debris and rubble was many feet deep on the beaches, being down in the crook,
Right.
where it just all collected.
Yeah.
But the house that was in my family, they didn't know, this was on Parker's River. I mean, it wasn't on the river, it was on the beach where the Red Jacket is. And they had put my great-grandmother on a train to return to Florida Labor Day weekend. Family went back to the New Bedford area. In came the hurricane. They came down the very next day by automobile. Route 28 was all closed off, meaning they couldn't get down to the shore. My mother knew her way through the woods, and as a young woman, she ran through the woods and came running back up to 28 to her parents and said, "It's gone. It's gone. Everything is gone. It's just..."
Yeah. No, it's
And they found a corner of the kitchen up where the drive-in theater used to be on 28.
Wow. No, it's a devastating experience for anybody who lives through a hurricane, whether or not they survive it. Certainly if they don't survive it. But this is not by way of a defense, but I want to tell you a funny story. When you write a book about a subject that has a lot of examples, you inevitably can't include all of them because, and my lighthouse book, there were 1,500 lighthouses in the United States at one point or another, almost 1,500. I only mentioned 165 of them. I gave a talk in Newburyport at a bookstore in Newburyport, and a woman sat right in the front row, and right before I started speaking, she goes, "Do you have Plum Island Lighthouse in your book?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Why not?" I said, "It's a popular narrative. I use the examples that help me tell the story. I can't include every single lighthouse." And she said, "Well, then I'm not going to buy a copy of your book." I said, "Okay." That was right before I started. And that's a good segue. If Titcomb's bookstore is here, if you want me to sign a book or you want to buy a book, that would be great. I'll put anything you want in it. I had one guy come up to me and say to sign it, "I couldn't have written this book without you." So whatever you want. But anyway, thanks again for inviting me.